The room was hushed, as if history itself had paused to listen. Soft afternoon light filtered through tall windows, resting gently on rows of waiting faces. On a modest stage, a man stepped forward, calm in posture, resolute in spirit. His name was Malcolm X. To some, he was a warning. To others, a beacon. To history, he would become both. Applause rose slowly, echoing against the walls, carrying with it years of anger, hope, and unanswered questions. Malcolm adjusted his notes, ready to speak once more about dignity, about justice, about a future that had not yet arrived. Then, without warning, the sound of gunfire shattered the stillness. In seconds, the voice that had challenged a nation was silenced. He was 39 years old. But this is not a story that ends with death. This is the story of a life that began in fear and poverty, shaped by racial violence and loss, hardened by the streets, and reborn through ideas powerful enough to shake the world. It is the journey of a boy named Malcolm Little, born into the rigid cruelty of Jim Crow America, who would rise to become one of the most influential revolutionary thinkers of the 20th century. A man unafraid to speak truths others refused to name. As you settle in and listen, allow this story to unfold slowly. Let it carry you through dark nights and awakening moments, through prisons and podiums, through anger, faith, and transformation. This is not only a history lesson, it is a human story, meant to be heard with an open heart. And if stories like this help you reflect, unwind, and see the past more clearly, consider subscribing to the channel and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement helps keep these quiet, meaningful histories alive and guides us toward the next story worth telling. Now, let us begin where all journeys do, at the roots. Chapter 1. Roots of Silence. In the warm spring of May 1925, in a small hospital room in Omaha, Nebraska, a child was born into a world already marked by struggle and expectation. They named him Malcolm Little, the fourth of 7 children in a family whose faith and courage were forged in the harsh realities of American racism. His father, Earl Little, was a Baptist lay speaker and devoted follower of Marcus Garvey's movement for Black self-reliance and pride. And his mother, Louise Little, served as a secretary and storyteller for the same cause. From his first breath, the air around Malcolm was thick with both hope and tension. The 1920s in the United States were years of stark contradiction. On one side, Black communities nurtured dreams of dignity and autonomy. On the other, violent white supremacist groups sought to strip those dreams away by fire and threat. Long before Malcolm could speak, his family's home was a target of Ku Klux Klan riders who stormed the property, brandishing rifles and shouting for his father to come out. When Malcolm was still a toddler, their house was attacked again, windows smashed, symbols of terror intended to drive them out. Despite these dangers, Earl was determined that his children inherit not fear, but purpose. He moved his family first to Milwaukee and then to Lansing, Michigan, building a life in community and resistance. But even that soil was not immune to the shadows of racism. In 1929, A blaze consumed the little home, and though no fire engines came to answer, the family survived, their spirits unsettled but intact. Tragedy struck with a quiet cruelty in 1931. Malcolm was only 6 years old when his father's body was found, eerily stretched across the trolley tracks outside town. Officials pronounced it an accident, but those who loved Earl knew better. His voice, unwavering against hatred, had made him many enemies. The community whispered of local white supremacists, emboldened by lawless contempt for black life. For young Malcolm and his siblings, the world grew heavier still. The family's pillar had been torn away, and the fragile structure left behind began to warp. Louise, worn by grief and hardship, suffered a psychological breakdown. In 1938, she was committed to a mental institution, where she would spend more than 2 decades. Her children were scattered, sent to relatives, foster homes, or institutions that neither understood nor protected their tender hearts. In those quiet years after loss, Malcolm learned what silence can teach. It can harden a young heart, but it can also awaken it, revealing the depth of wounds inflicted not just by circumstance, but by a society that too often denied black families their rightful peace. Beneath the surface of these early sorrows lay the root of a story that would someday roar. A story of survival, resistance, and the tireless pursuit of dignity in a world determined to deny it. Chapter 2. Shadows of the Street. By the time Malcolm reached his teenage years, the ground beneath him had never truly felt solid. After his mother was committed to a state hospital, the family scattered like leaves in a cold wind. Malcolm moved from one foster home to another, from institutions meant to correct behavior rather than heal wounds. Each place offered rules, but little understanding. In the quiet hours of the night, the boy learned that belonging was something other children were given, never something he could count on. In Lansing, Michigan, Malcolm proved himself bright and articulate, a student who read well and spoke clearly. Yet even promise had limits in the rigid world of Jim Crow America. When he told a teacher he dreamed of becoming a lawyer, the response was not encouragement, but dismissal. Such ambitions, he was told, were unrealistic for someone like him. The lesson was sharp and enduring. The world had already decided who he was allowed to be. Soon after, Malcolm was sent to Boston to live with his half-sister Ella Little, whose home in Roxbury opened a door to a different kind of education. The city moved fast, pulsing with energy and temptation. Jazz spilled from doorways, neon lights cut through the night, and the streets whispered promises of freedom and money. For a young man hungry for recognition, the streets offered what institutions never had: a sense of visibility. Malcolm took work shining shoes at a dance hall, where he watched the performers and hustlers with wide eyes. There, he learned the rhythms of survival, how to dress sharp, talk fast, and read danger in a man's eyes. He straightened his hair, wore flashy clothes, and adopted a new persona that masked the quiet ache beneath. Boston was not simply a city, it was a stage, and Malcolm was learning his role. Before long, the road carried him south to Harlem, New York, a place alive with motion, music, and desperation. Harlem in the 1940s was a world of contradictions. brilliance and poverty intertwined, opportunity shadowed by exploitation. Malcolm drifted deeper into the margins, drawn into gambling, drugs, and petty crime. Each step felt like control, but it was also a tightening circle. What had begun as escape slowly became entrapment. He later described these years with unsparing honesty, calling himself Detroit Red, a nickname earned from his reddish hair and restless presence. Beneath the bravado, however, lay a growing sense of disconnection from society, from stability, and from himself. The streets did not judge him, but they did not save him either. By his early 20s, the path Malcolm walked narrowed sharply. Arrests followed, and in 1946, the law closed its grip. Convicted of burglary, he was sentenced to prison. To the outside world, it was the predictable end of a troubled youth. But in the stillness that followed, behind bars and locked doors, the shadows that had shaped him would soon give way to an unexpected awakening. In the quiet dark of confinement, the street finally fell silent. And in that silence, Malcolm began to listen. Chapter 3. The Prison of Transformation. In 1946, the restless movement of Malcolm's life came to an abrupt halt. Arrested for burglary and sentenced to prison, he was removed from the streets that had shaped him and placed behind walls designed to confine both body and spirit. To many, incarceration marked an ending, a confirmation that society's quiet predictions had been correct. For Malcolm, it marked something far more complicated, the beginning of a profound inner reckoning. Prison was a harsh and unyielding world. Days followed rigid routines, and nights stretched long and unforgiving. At first, Malcolm carried his anger with him like armor. He challenged authority, argued relentlessly, and earned a reputation as a difficult inmate. Yet beneath the defiance was a mind still searching for purpose, still restless, still awake. It was during these years that Malcolm encountered a fellow prisoner whose influence would quietly change the course of his life. The man was known among inmates as Bimby, respected not for strength or intimidation, but for intellect. He spoke clearly, debated fiercely, and commanded attention through knowledge alone. Watching him, Malcolm began to sense a different kind of power, one not taken by force, but earned through understanding. Slowly, almost reluctantly, Malcolm turned toward books. The prison library became his refuge. He read with urgency, devouring history, philosophy, religion, and politics. When words failed him, he copied the dictionary by hand, page after page, teaching himself language as if reclaiming something long denied. Each definition sharpened his thinking. Each sentence widened the narrow walls of his cell. In the quiet hours, reading replaced resentment, and discipline replaced chaos. Letters from the outside world began to arrive, carrying new ideas with them. His siblings, particularly his brother Reginald, wrote about a religious movement called the Nation of Islam. They spoke of discipline, self-respect, and the belief that black people must reclaim their identity after centuries of oppression. At first, Malcolm resisted. Religion, like many institutions, felt suspect. But curiosity took hold, and he began to listen. The teachings of the Nation of Islam offered Malcolm a framework through which his personal suffering connected to a broader historical injustice. They explained his pain not as individual failure, but as part of a collective wound inflicted by racism and exclusion. The message was strict, uncompromising, and deeply empowering. In prison, where identity was stripped away daily, such clarity held immense appeal. As Malcolm's beliefs evolved, so did his behavior. He abandoned drugs, rejected the habits of the street, and embraced self-discipline with almost obsessive focus. Guards noticed the change. Fellow inmates listened when he spoke. Debate became his craft, words his chosen instrument. The young man once shaped by chaos was now shaping himself with intention. By the time Malcolm prepared for release, he was no longer the man who had entered prison. The cell that had confined him had also, paradoxically, freed him. Through self-education, reflection, and belief, Malcolm had undergone a transformation that could not be undone. The prison doors would soon open, but the most important escape had already taken place, quietly, within the mind of a man who was just beginning to discover his voice. Chapter 4. The Birth of X. When Malcolm walked out of prison in 1952, he stepped into the world carrying more than freedom in his hands. He carried a new discipline, a sharpened mind, and the question that would soon demand an answer. Who was he now? The name he had been given, Malcolm Little, no longer felt like an anchor to identity. Instead, it felt like a reminder of something stolen. Within the teachings of the Nation of Islam, names were not mere labels. They were histories. The surname Little, Malcolm came to believe, was not truly his own, but the mark of enslavers who had erased African identities and replaced them with something convenient and disposable. To continue carrying that name felt, to him, like accepting a silence imposed generations before he was born. So Malcolm let it go. In its place, he chose a single letter, X. It was not a flourish or a symbol of mystery. It was an admission of loss. The X stood for the unknown African name that slavery had taken from his ancestors, a space where memory had been forcibly erased. By choosing it, Malcolm was not claiming something new. He was refusing to pretend that the old story was complete. With this act, Malcolm X was born. The transformation was not only personal, it was public. Under the guidance of Elijah Muhammad, leader of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm began to speak in small gatherings, then in larger halls. His early sermons were intense and precise, delivered with a clarity sharpened by years of study and reflection. He spoke of self-respect, moral discipline, and the need for Black Americans to reclaim control over their lives in a society that had long denied them dignity. Those who listened felt the difference immediately. Malcolm did not speak like a man repeating doctrine. He spoke like someone who had lived the consequences of its absence. His words carried the weight of prison walls, the bitterness of lost childhood, and the conviction of hard-won understanding. In a time when many voices softened their language to be heard, Malcolm's voice cut cleanly through the noise. The Nation of Islam recognized his potential quickly. What began as informal talks soon became formal appointments. Malcolm traveled, organized, and debated. Each speech refined his presence. Each audience strengthened his resolve. The name X became inseparable from the force of his delivery. Short, sharp, unforgettable. Yet beneath the growing recognition, the meaning of that letter remained deeply personal. It was a quiet protest against historical erasure and a declaration that identity could be reclaimed, even when its original shape had been destroyed. In choosing the name Malcolm X, he did more than rename himself. He announced the beginning of a life lived in deliberate defiance of silence, and the emergence of a voice the nation would soon be unable to ignore. Chapter 5. Rise in the Nation. When Malcolm X began his work with the Nation of Islam in the early 1950s, few could have predicted how swiftly his voice would rise above the many that spoke in the movement's name. Newly released from prison in 1952, he devoted himself with singular intensity to the teachings of Elijah Muhammad, traveling where he was sent, speaking where he was asked, and absorbing every lesson with near religious discipline. His first assignments took him to Detroit and Boston, cities where small temples struggled to gain attention in a society largely deaf to their message. Malcolm approached the task methodically. He studied doctrine late into the night, memorized speeches, and learned to anticipate the questions and doubts of his listeners. His delivery was calm but commanding, precise without hesitation. Slowly, audiences grew. Soon, Malcolm was called to Harlem, a neighborhood alive with history, pain, and political hunger. There, in Temple Number 7, his presence transformed the room. He spoke not only to belief, but to experience, of poverty, incarceration, and humiliation known intimately by those who filled the seats. His words gave structure to anger and purpose to frustration. For many, listening to Malcolm felt like being named at last. Unlike other ministers, Malcolm excelled in public debate. He appeared on radio programs, confronted critics in open forums, and defended the Nation of Islam with sharp logic and unwavering confidence. He did not soften his message for comfort. He spoke of separation, self-determination, and moral discipline as necessities rather than ideals. In a time when civil rights discourse often emphasized patience, Malcolm's insistence on urgency felt electric. By the mid-1950s, his influence was undeniable. Membership in the Nation of Islam grew rapidly, particularly in northern cities, and Malcolm became its most recognizable public figure. Newspapers quoted him, television cameras followed him, admirers praised his fearlessness, opponents labeled him dangerous. Both, in their own way, acknowledged his power. Yet his rise was not driven by ambition alone. Malcolm lived simply, often exhausting himself with constant travel and organization. He recruited new ministers, established temples, and enforced strict discipline among members. His loyalty to Elijah Muhammad appeared absolute, rooted in gratitude for the teachings that had reshaped his life. Behind closed doors, however, the weight of leadership pressed heavily. Malcolm understood that his words carried consequences, not only for himself, but for thousands who saw in him a reflection of their own struggle. Each speech was carefully shaped, each statement sharpened by the awareness that the nation was listening. By the end of the decade, Malcolm X stood at the center of a growing movement, his voice echoing far beyond mosque walls. He had risen from obscurity to prominence through nothing more and nothing less than the disciplined power of speech. And as his influence expanded, so too did the tension between the man he was becoming and the institution he served, a tension that would soon demand its reckoning. Chapter 6. Voice of a Movement. By the early 1960s, Malcolm X was no longer simply a minister speaking within the walls of the Nation of Islam. He had become a national presence, a figure whose words traveled faster than his footsteps, carried by newspapers, radio broadcasts, and the grainy glow of television screens. Wherever he appeared, crowds gathered. Some came in admiration, others in anger, but few left unchanged. Malcolm's power did not rest in volume alone. It lived in precision. He spoke with a rhythm that felt deliberate, almost measured, yet charged with urgency. Each sentence landed like a step forward, each pause an invitation to think. He framed the daily humiliations of Black Americans, police violence, economic exclusion, political neglect, not as isolated misfortunes, but as evidence of a system designed to deny dignity. In doing so, he gave language to emotions many had carried in silence. Unlike other civil rights leaders of the era, Malcolm rejected appeals to moral sympathy. He spoke instead of self-defense, self-respect, and political power. To his listeners, this felt bracingly honest. To his critics, it sounded dangerous. Yet Malcolm did not seek comfort or approval. He sought clarity. His visibility grew rapidly after a 1959 television documentary introduced the Nation of Islam to a wider audience. Suddenly, Malcolm X was everywhere, debating scholars, answering hostile questions, standing firm under relentless scrutiny. Each appearance sharpened his public image, uncompromising, articulate, and deeply aware of history's weight. In 1964, at a moment when the civil rights movement stood at a crossroads, Malcolm delivered what would become one of his most enduring speeches, "The Ballot or the Bullet." Spoken in Cleveland and later in Detroit, the address marked a subtle but significant shift. Malcolm spoke not only as a religious minister, but as a political thinker. He urged Black Americans to understand voting not as a symbolic gesture, but as a practical tool, and warned that continued exclusion would inevitably lead to unrest. The speech was calm in tone, almost conversational, yet its message was unmistakably firm. Malcolm did not call for violence. He spoke of consequence. If justice could not be achieved through the ballot, he argued, history suggested that the bullet would follow. The words unsettled many, but they resonated deeply with those who felt promises had been endlessly postponed. What set Malcolm apart was his ability to draw energy from the public while simultaneously challenging it. He did not flatter his audiences. He demanded discipline, awareness, and responsibility. In return, he received loyalty, attention, and a growing sense that he spoke for something larger than himself. As his influence expanded, Malcolm X became a mirror in which America saw a reflection it could not easily ignore. He stood at the intersection of anger and hope, articulating a vision that was neither gentle nor vague, but unmistakably alive. In these years, his voice no longer belonged solely to a movement. It had become part of the national conversation. And with that prominence came both power and peril, drawing Malcolm ever closer to a turning point that would redefine his life once again. Chapter 7. Cracks in the Faith. At the height of his influence within the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X appeared unshakable. He spoke with confidence, commanded crowds, and defended the movement with unwavering loyalty. Yet, beneath the surface of public certainty, quiet fractures were beginning to form. Small at first, then impossible to ignore. The first cracks emerged not from enemies, but from within. As Malcolm's responsibilities grew, so did his proximity to the inner workings of the organization. What he encountered there unsettled him deeply. He learned that Elijah Muhammad, the man he revered as a moral and spiritual guide, had violated the very codes of conduct he preached, engaging in secret relationships with young women who were members of the nation. The revelation struck Malcolm not merely as personal disappointment, but as a betrayal of principle. For a man who had rebuilt his life on discipline and moral clarity, the contradiction was devastating. Malcolm wrestled with the knowledge in silence, torn between loyalty and conscience. He did not immediately speak out. Instead, he watched, waited, and questioned, hoping perhaps that truth might somehow reconcile itself. At the same time, deeper ideological tensions began to surface. Malcolm's worldview was expanding. He followed global events closely, the independence movements in Africa, the growing international language of human rights, the pressure mounting on colonial powers. Increasingly, he saw the struggle of Black Americans not as an isolated issue, but as part of a worldwide fight against oppression. The Nation of Islam, however, remained inward-looking. Its leadership discouraged political engagement beyond its own structure and rejected alliances with broader civil rights organizations. Malcolm began to feel constrained, as though the movement that had once liberated his mind was now placing boundaries around it. The tension reached a breaking point in November 1963, following the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. When asked for comment, Malcolm described the killing as "the chickens coming home to roost," a phrase meant to critique America's long history of violence rather than celebrate the act itself. The remark ignited outrage. In response, the Nation of Islam silenced Malcolm, suspending him from public speaking for 90 days. The punishment was more than disciplinary. It was symbolic. Malcolm understood the message clearly. His voice, once the movement's most powerful instrument, had become a liability. During his enforced silence, reflection replaced rhetoric. He revisited the doubts he had buried and allowed himself to confront questions he could no longer suppress. What troubled him most was not personal status, but truth. If a movement demanded unquestioning loyalty at the cost of honesty, what did that say about its foundation? Malcolm had once believed faith meant obedience. Now he began to see that faith without integrity was hollow. As the weeks passed, distance sharpened his clarity. He recognized that his devotion to Elijah Muhammad had been rooted in gratitude, but gratitude alone could not sustain belief. The man who had taught him to think critically had, in the end, taught him to question even his teachers. By early 1964, the cracks had widened into an irreversible divide. Malcolm stood at a crossroads, painfully aware that leaving the Nation of Islam would cost him protection, community, and perhaps his life. Yet remaining would mean surrendering the very principles that had transformed him. The faith that once gave him structure was slipping away. In its place stood uncertainty, frightening, lonely, but honest. And for Malcolm X, honesty had become a necessity he could no longer deny. Chapter 8. Parting Ways. In March 1964, Malcolm X made a decision that would permanently alter the course of his life. After more than a decade as the Nation of Islam's most visible and compelling voice, he announced his formal departure. The break was public, irreversible, and fraught with danger. For Malcolm, it marked the end of certainty and the beginning of a solitary road forward. Leaving the Nation of Islam was not simply an organizational change. It meant severing ties with a community that had given him purpose, discipline, and protection. It also meant stepping into a space where former allies might become adversaries. Malcolm understood this risk clearly. Threats had already begun to circulate. Friends warned him to be careful. Yet he moved forward with calm resolve, convinced that truth demanded independence. In the weeks following his departure, Malcolm worked quietly but intensely. He reflected on what he believed, what he rejected, and what he still needed to understand. The teachings that had once felt absolute now seemed incomplete. He no longer wished to define the struggle of Black Americans solely through separation or doctrine. Instead, he sought a broader framework, one that allowed faith, politics, and human rights to exist side by side. Out of this period of reflection emerged Muslim Mosque, Inc., an organization Malcolm founded to provide religious structure without the rigid boundaries of his former movement. It was intentionally modest in scale, flexible in belief, and open to growth. Malcolm did not position himself as a prophet or supreme authority. He presented himself as a student, still learning, still searching. Yet the loneliness of independence weighed heavily. Without the Nation of Islam's institutional support, Malcolm faced logistical challenges and constant surveillance. Media attention intensified, often framing him as a man in retreat or disarray. In reality, he was rebuilding from the ground up, piece by careful piece. Publicly, Malcolm spoke with restraint. Gone was the familiar certainty of earlier years. In its place was a more reflective tone, measured, inquisitive, and evolving. He acknowledged change openly, admitting that some of his previous views were limited by the structure that shaped them. This honesty unsettled critics and followers alike. Some felt betrayed. Others leaned in closer, sensing the emergence of something deeper. Privately, Malcolm prepared for a journey that would reshape him once again. He felt drawn toward a fuller understanding of Islam, one beyond the racial framework he had known. The idea of pilgrimage began to take form, not as symbolism, but as necessity. He wanted to see the faith as it existed beyond American borders, beyond division. As spring turned toward summer, Malcolm stood exposed, yet determined. He had left behind a powerful institution, but carried forward an unyielding commitment to dignity and justice. The path ahead was uncertain, but it was his own. In parting from the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X did not abandon belief. He reclaimed it, stripped of illusion, heavy with responsibility, and open to transformation. And though the road forward would test him more severely than any he had walked before, it would also lead him closer to the truth he had been seeking all along. Chapter 9. Journey to Mecca. In the spring of 1964, Malcolm X left the familiar streets of America and stepped into a journey that would quietly, but irrevocably, reshape his understanding of the world. Carrying little more than faith and uncertainty, he traveled to the Middle East to undertake the Hajj, the Islamic pilgrimage to Mecca, a ritual he had long spoken about, yet never fully understood until he lived it. From the moment he arrived, Malcolm sensed that he had entered a space unlike any he had known before. Mecca was alive with motion and devotion. Pilgrims from every corner of the globe moved together. Africans, Asians, Europeans, Arabs, different in language, skin tone, and culture, yet bound by a single rhythm of prayer. For a man whose life had been shaped by the brutal clarity of racial division, the sight was disarming. Malcolm observed carefully, as he always did. He noted how men with the palest skin and bluest eyes ate from the same plates as those whose ancestors had endured slavery. They prayed shoulder to shoulder, addressed one another as brothers, and shared gestures of kindness without hesitation. No hierarchy marked their gathering, no color assigned status. In that sacred space, difference existed without dominance. The experience unsettled Malcolm in the most productive way. For years he had believed that separation was the only honest response to oppression. Now he was witnessing a form of unity he had once thought impossible, not imagined, but practiced. Islam, as lived in Mecca, was not confined by race. It was global, disciplined, and expansive. During the pilgrimage, Malcolm adopted a new name, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz, signaling both his completed journey and his evolving identity. He wrote letters home describing his transformation with clarity and humility. He admitted that some of his previous conclusions about race had been shaped by the narrow boundaries of his experience. In Mecca, those boundaries dissolved. Yet this was not a rejection of his past. It was a refinement of it. Malcolm did not abandon his commitment to justice or his awareness of America's racial wounds. Instead, he gained a broader lens through which to view them. He began to frame the struggle of Black Americans as part of a larger human rights issue, one that connected to people resisting oppression across continents. The pilgrimage also brought him peace. In the quiet moments between prayers, Malcolm reflected on the weight he had carried for so long, the anger, the urgency, the isolation. Mecca offered him something rare: stillness without surrender, faith without bitterness. When Malcolm left Mecca, he was no longer the same man who had arrived. His voice, once sharpened by division, was now tempered by understanding. He had seen a world where unity did not require denial of difference, and where belief could transcend the scars of history. The journey had not softened him, it had widened him. And as Malcolm prepared to return home, he carried with him a vision larger than any single movement. A vision that would redefine his final year, and the legacy he would leave behind. Chapter 10. A New Vision. When Malcolm returned to the United States in 1964, he did not announce his transformation with spectacle. There was no dramatic declaration, no sudden abandonment of the past. Instead, change revealed itself quietly, in the tone of his voice, in the patience of his words, and in the name he now carried, El-Hajj Malik El-Shabazz. The name reflected more than a completed pilgrimage. It marked a turning inward and outward at once. El-Hajj acknowledged his journey to Mecca. Malik El-Shabazz signaled a reclaimed identity rooted in dignity rather than loss. Yet Malcolm understood that names alone could not carry meaning unless they were matched by action. What had truly changed was not who he opposed, but how he understood the struggle itself. Before Mecca, Malcolm had spoken primarily of separation as a form of survival. After Mecca, he spoke of human rights, a language broader, more inclusive, and deliberately global. He no longer framed the fight of Black Americans as an isolated moral failing of the United States, but as part of a worldwide pattern of oppression that demanded international attention. This shift did not dilute his urgency, it refined it. Malcolm began to speak of coalition, not as compromise, but as strategy. He acknowledged that racism remained deeply embedded in American life, yet he now rejected the idea that race alone determined moral capacity. What mattered, he argued, was behavior, systems of power, and the willingness to confront injustice wherever it appeared. His message unsettled old allies and confounded long-time critics. Some accused him of inconsistency, others sensed evolution. Public appearances during this period revealed a calmer, more deliberate presence. Malcolm still spoke with clarity and force, but anger no longer dominated his delivery. In its place was a measured confidence, shaped by observation rather than confrontation. He challenged audiences to think beyond slogans and towards structure, to consider laws, institutions, and international pressure as tools of change. Central to this new vision was the belief that the struggle for black freedom in America could not succeed in isolation. Malcolm spoke openly about bringing the United States before international forums, framing racial discrimination as a violation of human rights rather than a domestic issue. In doing so, he placed America's internal contradictions under global scrutiny. Yet, even as his vision widened, Malcolm remained grounded in the lived realities of his people. He did not ask for patience. He did not promise ease. He asked instead for clarity, discipline, and solidarity across difference. This phase of his life was brief but luminous. In embracing a broader vision of freedom, one that allowed for unity without erasure, Malcolm had reached a rare balance between conviction and openness. He was no longer defined by what he rejected, but by what he sought to build. And in that new clarity, his final path began to take shape. Bright, dangerous, and unmistakably his own. Chapter 11. Continents and Crowds. After his return from Mecca, Malcolm X did not settle back into American life. Instead, he turned outward, following a path that stretched far beyond national borders. In 1964, he embarked on a series of journeys across Africa and the Middle East, determined to understand the global dimensions of struggle, freedom, and power. What he encountered there would deepen his conviction that the fight for justice could no longer be confined to one country or one people. Africa greeted Malcolm not as a visitor, but as a witness to history in motion. Across the continent, newly independent nations were emerging from the long shadow of colonial rule. In Ghana, Nigeria, Egypt, Algeria, Tanzania, and other states, leaders were shaping futures still fragile and uncertain. Malcolm listened closely. He observed how revolutions were born not only from resistance, but from careful organization, diplomacy, and unity. One of the most significant moments of this journey came when Malcolm attended meetings connected to the Organization of African Unity, OAU. There, he engaged with heads of state and diplomats who viewed the African-American struggle as inseparable from the global fight against imperialism and racial hierarchy. For the first time, Malcolm saw the possibility of framing civil rights in the United States as an international human rights issue, one that could be raised before the world, not confined within American courts. In these conversations, Malcolm was no longer speaking solely as a protester. He spoke as an observer of systems, a student of power. He drew parallels between segregation and colonial domination, between police violence and military repression. The language of freedom, he realized, was universal, even when its accents differed. Crowds gathered wherever he went. Students, activists, and ordinary citizens listened as Malcolm described the realities of life in America, stories of discrimination that echoed their own histories. In return, they shared their experiences of resistance, their strategies for survival, and their visions of sovereignty. These exchanges reinforced a growing truth. Isolation weakened movements, connection strengthened them. Yet Malcolm's travels were not romanticized. He saw the complexity of post-colonial nations, the internal divisions, economic struggles, and lingering influence of former powers. Freedom, he understood, was not a destination, but a continuous negotiation. This realism sharpened his perspective rather than diminishing his hope. When Malcolm prepared to return to the United States, he carried more than notes and memories. He carried a sense of scale. The struggle he had once framed in the language of American injustice now existed within a vast, interconnected landscape of global resistance. Continents and crowds, he would later reflect, had taught him that dignity was not a regional demand. It was a human one. And as he stepped back onto American soil, Malcolm X was resolved to speak not only for his people, but with the authority of a world that was watching. Chapter 12. Threats in the Wind. By late 1964, the air around Malcolm X had grown heavy with warning. His break from the Nation of Islam was no longer a matter of ideology alone. It had become a matter of survival. Words once exchanged in disagreement hardened into silence, and silence in turn gave way to menace. Malcolm understood this progression well. He had lived long enough inside the movement to recognize its signals. Threats arrived steadily. Some whispered through intermediaries, others delivered openly. Former allies turned away in public. Familiar faces watched from a distance. Malcolm spoke less of danger, but he adjusted his habits instinctively. He changed routines, limited appearances, and remained constantly alert. The confidence he carried on stage now had to coexist with caution off it. Despite the growing risks, Malcolm refused to retreat into obscurity. He continued to speak, to organize, and to challenge power structures, both domestic and international. Yet the cost of independence became increasingly clear. Without the protection of a large organization, he stood exposed, visible, vocal, and alone. The danger became undeniable in February 1965, when Malcolm's family home in East Elmhurst, Queens, was attacked. In the early hours of the morning, flames tore through the house, while Malcolm, his wife Betty, and their daughters were inside. They escaped without loss of life, but the message was unmistakable. This was no longer rhetoric. It was violence aimed not only at Malcolm, but at those he loved most. In the aftermath, Malcolm surveyed the damage with a calm that bordered on solemn acceptance. He did not dramatize the event. He did not plead for sympathy. Instead, he spoke quietly of responsibility, of what it meant to stand by one's beliefs, even when the consequences were immediate and personal. The attack deepened Malcolm's sense of isolation. Former protections had vanished, and the institutions meant to ensure safety showed little urgency. Still, he pressed forward, convinced that retreat would render his final years meaningless. He believed that fear, once allowed to dictate action, became another form of captivity. Yet the strain was evident. Friends noted his exhaustion. His voice, though steady, carried the weight of foreknowledge. Malcolm knew that time was no longer generous. He also knew that his ideas, now broader, more inclusive, and more dangerous to entrenched power, could not be unsaid. In these final months, Malcolm lived with an awareness sharpened by every footstep and every unfamiliar sound. The threats in the wind were constant, unseen but unmistakable. Still, he chose presence over safety, truth over concealment. He had escaped one prison long ago by embracing knowledge. Now, faced with a different kind of confinement, the pressure to disappear, Malcolm X made the same choice once more. To stand, to speak, and to move forward, even as the storm closed in around him. Chapter 13. The Audubon Ballroom. On the morning of February 21st, 1965, Manhattan woke beneath a pale winter sky. Snow from the previous days lingered in corners and along curbs, dulling the city's usual clamor. Inside the Audubon Ballroom, on West 165th Street, folding chairs were arranged in neat rows. A small stage stood ready beneath modest lights. It was meant to be an ordinary Sunday gathering, another address by Malcolm X to supporters of the Organization of Afro-American Unity. Yet nothing about that day was ordinary. The audience began to arrive shortly after noon. Families, students, activists, and curious onlookers filled the room. Some had followed Malcolm for years, from the days of fiery sermons in Harlem. Others were newcomers, drawn by his recent transformation and global vision. There was anticipation in the air, but also unease. Recent threats, the firebombing of his home, and rumors of danger weighed silently on the crowd. Malcolm arrived shortly before speaking time. He appeared composed, dressed formally, his posture calm and deliberate. Those close to him noticed no hesitation. If he felt the gravity of the moment, he carried it inwardly. He had chosen not to cancel, not to hide. To Malcolm, silence in the face of fear was a form of surrender. Shortly after 3 p.m., Malcolm stepped onto the stage. Applause rose, steady but restrained. As he approached the lectern, a disturbance erupted near the front rows. Voices raised, bodies shifting. It seemed, at first, like a common disruption, the kind Malcolm had encountered many times before. Then the illusion of normality shattered. Gunfire broke through the hall, sharp, unmistakable, final. Chaos followed in an instant. People screamed and ducked, chairs overturned. In the confusion, Malcolm fell backward, struck multiple times. Within moments, the man who had survived prisons, street violence, and relentless surveillance lay mortally wounded before the very audience he had come to address. The attack lasted only seconds. Its consequences would echo for generations. Emergency responders rushed to the scene, but there was nothing they could do. Malcolm X was pronounced dead shortly after, at the age of 39. The news spread rapidly across New York, then the nation, and soon the world. Shock gave way to grief. Grief turned into reflection. Reflection hardened into history. The Audubon Ballroom, once a neighborhood gathering space, became a site of collective memory. It marked the violent end of a life lived in relentless pursuit of dignity and truth. Malcolm had been many things: criminal, convert, minister, revolutionary, international human rights advocate. In death, he became something else entirely, a symbol of unfinished struggle. Reactions were immediate and divided. Admirers mourned a voice silenced too soon. Critics measured his legacy with caution. Even those who had opposed him could not ignore the magnitude of what had been lost. Malcolm's ideas, sharpened in his final year, were only beginning to take root. The tragedy of the Audubon Ballroom was not merely the loss of a man, but the interruption of a journey still unfolding. Malcolm had moved beyond rigid doctrines toward a broader human vision, one that challenged racism not only as a national crime, but as a global injustice. His death froze that evolution in time, leaving the world to imagine what might have followed. As evening fell over Manhattan, the city resumed its rhythm, unaware that it had crossed an invisible threshold. History had turned a page in blood and silence, and somewhere between the echoes of gunfire and the stunned quiet that followed, Malcolm X passed from the present into legend. His voice gone, but his questions left unanswered, lingering in the long night ahead. Chapter 14. After the Shot. The gunfire had barely faded when the weight of reality settled over the Audubon Ballroom. What followed was not rage, but stunned stillness, an almost unbearable quiet after chaos. People stood frozen, some crying openly, others unable to speak at all. A life had ended in front of them, and with it, a sense of safety that could never be restored. News traveled fast. Within hours, radios across New York interrupted programming. By evening, newspapers rushed out special editions. The headlines were blunt and devastating. Malcolm X assassinated in Harlem Ballroom. Across the United States, reactions poured in. Grief, confusion, condemnation, and reflection. For supporters, it felt like a personal loss. For the nation, it was another reminder of how violently the struggle for racial justice could unfold. At the center of the tragedy was Betty Shabazz, Malcolm's wife, who was present at the ballroom that day. Pregnant at the time and already a mother to 4 young daughters, she faced a future reshaped in an instant. The family home had been firebombed only days earlier. Now the protector and provider was gone. Grief for the Shabazz family was not abstract. It was immediate, intimate, and enduring. In the days that followed, Malcolm's body lay in repose as thousands filed past to pay their respects. Activists stood shoulder to shoulder with ordinary citizens. Some wept silently. Others clenched their fists in quiet resolve. His funeral drew international attention, attended by civil rights leaders, diplomats, and community members who had once argued fiercely with him, yet now recognized the scale of his loss. Meanwhile, investigations began almost immediately. Suspects were arrested, trials prepared, and questions raised. Some answered, many left unresolved. The official story would satisfy few completely. Rumors, doubts, and later re-examinations would follow for decades, feeding a sense that the full truth had slipped through history's fingers. Beyond the courtroom, Malcolm's organizations faced an uncertain future. Without his presence, leadership fractured. Momentum slowed. Some followers carried forward his evolving message of human rights and global solidarity. Others drifted away, unsure how to continue without the man who had given the movement its voice. Yet even in death, Malcolm X refused to disappear. His speeches were replayed. His words were printed, studied, and argued over. His life story, raw, painful, unfinished, began to circulate far beyond the communities that had first claimed him. For many young Black Americans, he became a figure of awakening. For others around the world, he emerged as a symbol of resistance against oppression in all its forms. The days after the shot were marked by loss and separation, but they also revealed something quieter and more enduring. Malcolm X had outgrown his own lifetime. Though the man was gone, the ideas he left behind had only begun their long journey through history. Chapter 15. Echoes of a Voice. Long after the shots at the Audubon Ballroom fell silent, the voice of Malcolm X continued to travel. Through classrooms and prisons, through protest lines and quiet bedrooms where radios once whispered his speeches late at night. Death had ended the man, but it had sharpened the message. In the years that followed 1965, Malcolm X became inseparable from the rise of the Black Power movement. Younger activists, disillusioned with slow progress and polite appeals, found in his words a language that matched their anger and urgency. He had spoken openly about self-defense, self-respect, and self-determination, ideas that resonated deeply in urban neighborhoods still scarred by poverty, police violence, and segregation. Groups like the Black Panther Party did not copy Malcolm directly, but they echoed his insistence on dignity without apology. Yet Malcolm's legacy was never singular or static. Some remembered the fiery minister who condemned white supremacy in uncompromising terms. Others pointed to the man he was becoming near the end of his life, one who spoke of human rights rather than civil rights, of global solidarity rather than racial isolation. These two images often seemed to clash, but together they revealed the true complexity of his journey. Malcolm X was not a finished doctrine. He was a process. The publication of The Autobiography of Malcolm X, completed shortly after his death, carried that process into the world. Read by millions, the book offered something rare in American history: a public figure who admitted transformation, contradiction, and growth. For generations of readers, especially young people, it became a quiet companion, read not only for politics, but for permission to change. Beyond the United States, Malcolm's influence spread across Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. His insistence that racism in America was part of a global system of oppression found new relevance in post-colonial societies. Activists fighting apartheid, imperialism, and ethnic discrimination recognized in Malcolm a shared struggle. He had named their pain before he ever set foot on their soil. In the contemporary world, Malcolm X remains present, invoked in debates about policing, mass incarceration, cultural identity, and resistance. His image appears on murals and posters, his quotes circulate online, often shortened, sometimes misunderstood. He is praised, criticized, simplified, and reclaimed again and again. Each generation reshapes him according to its own fears and hopes. What endures most powerfully is not a single slogan, but a question Malcolm left behind. What does freedom truly require? Is it patience, confrontation, separation, or unity? His life offered no easy answers, only the insistence that injustice must be named, studied, and challenged wherever it appears. In the soft light of history, Malcolm X no longer stands only as a radical or a martyr. He stands as a reminder that awakening is rarely comfortable, that clarity often comes through conflict, and that voices silenced too early can still shape the future. As night settles and the story draws to a close, his words remain, restless, searching, unfinished, moving quietly from one generation to the next, asking listeners to stay awake just a little longer. Epilogue. The shadow becomes light. History has a quiet way of softening its sharpest edges. What once felt like fire becomes warmth. What once seemed like shadow slowly reveals its shape as light. Decades after his death, Malcolm X continues to move through the world in unexpected places. His name is spoken not only in history books, but on street corners and subway platforms. In New York City, a station bears his name near the neighborhood where he once walked and spoke. Murals rise on brick walls, his gaze painted bold and unblinking, watching over streets still wrestling with inequality. The Audubon Ballroom itself has been transformed into a site of memory, education, and reflection. A place where silence now teaches as powerfully as speech once did. On stages and screens, Malcolm's story is retold again and again. Plays, documentaries, films, and lectures revisit his life, not to freeze him in time, but to ask what his journey means now. Each retelling emphasizes something different: the wounded child, the disciplined student, the uncompromising orator, the pilgrim who returned changed. Together, they form a portrait not of perfection, but of growth. Perhaps that is why his legacy endures. Malcolm X never claimed to be complete. He admitted his mistakes, revised his beliefs, and allowed experience to reshape his understanding of humanity. In doing so, he left behind something rarer than certainty: permission to evolve. For movements seeking justice, this lesson remains vital. Progress is not linear, awakening is not instant, and reconciliation, within oneself and with others, often comes only after struggle. In classrooms, young people still encounter his words for the first time. Some are startled by their force. Others are drawn to their honesty. Many recognize, in his transformation, their own questions about identity, dignity, and belonging. Malcolm speaks to those moments of quiet restlessness, when the world feels unjust and the path forward unclear. Over time, the shadow that once followed his name has shifted. Where fear and controversy once dominated, understanding has grown. Not agreement. Malcolm X was never meant to be universally agreeable, but respect for the seriousness of his moral inquiry. He asked his generation to look unflinchingly at injustice. He asks ours to do the same. As this story comes to rest, it does not close. Like Malcolm himself, it remains unfinished, living on in conversations, in acts of courage, in the long pursuit of fairness that stretches beyond any single lifetime. If you found meaning in this journey, take a moment to subscribe to the channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and let us know how Malcolm X's story resonates with you today. These conversations keep history alive, not as distant memory, but as a living guide for the future. And now, as the night grows quiet, we leave Malcolm where he has always belonged. Not in darkness, but in a steady, enduring light that continues to guide those still searching for justice.